for about 40 years. For you, Nick. Thank you. Keep it down. I've been arguing that we need to bring about a revolution in academia so that the basic aim becomes wisdom and not just knowledge. Wisdom being nothing guru-ish, but the capacity, the active endeavour, and possibly the desire to realise what is of value in life for oneself and others. It would mean that we put problems of living at the heart of the enterprise, and the pursuit of knowledge and technological know-how, of course, is important, but secondary. This is one of these talks that's going to be punctuated by off-scene cheers. So be it. These two books are the first step in the argument for wisdom inquiry. And they're both about science, and they're both in somewhat different ways, but ways that interrelate, argue for a revolution in science. Decisively. A revolution in the whole nature of science, how we understand it and how we do it. So let me begin with this one, the Green Book. Someone's obviously pressing a button somewhere. In praise of natural philosophy. It's arguing that we need to put together philosophy and science and recreate a kind of modern version of natural philosophy. First of all, we've got to reform philosophy so that the basic task of philosophy becomes to keep alive imaginative and critical thinking about our fundamental problems, global problems that cut across all disciplinary boundaries and all aspects of life. And especially thinking about our most fundamental problem of all, the problem that encompasses all the others, and which one can state quite straightforwardly like this: how can our human world, the world as we experience it, this world that we're in now, with people and colours and sounds and smells and consciousness and a bit of free will perhaps and meaning and value, how can all this, including sentient life as well as conscious life, how can all this exist and best flourish, embedded as it is in the physical universe? And that encompasses everything from theoretical physics to the humanities. This is a revolutionary book. It says so in the subtitle, A Revolution for Thought and Life. But it's also very conservative, almost reactionary, because, of course, modern science began as natural philosophy. And then it's split into these two parts, philosophy and science. And both those two parts, philosophy, those two parts of natural philosophy, were responsible for this splitting. Philosophy began very well with Cartesian dualism, which you can easily appreciate is a sort of a first stab at a solution to what I called our fundamental problem, the human world, physical universe problem. It's obviously untenable because it creates horrendous problems about free will and how we can know anything. If we're all locked into our minds, how can we know anything about the physical universe? But nevertheless, it's a brilliant first stab, and what ought to have happened is that philosophers should have said, excellent Descartes, you've done wonderfully, but we need to think again, we need to think something better, we need to return to the fundamental problem. That isn't what happened. What happened was that philosophers subsequently struggled with the problems that Descartes generated, even though they rejected the view that generated all these problems. And in particular, they struggled with the problem of how on earth we can know anything about the external world. That was the way the problems formulated. And increasingly, philosophers came to the view that we can't. Berkeley famously held the view that to exist is to be perceived. There is only sense impressions. So did Hume. And Kant held the view that the real world, the noumenal world as he called it, all you can say about it is that it exists. You can't say anything else at all. So you can't even formulate the fundamental problem. And philosophers became more and more removed from science, even hostile to science, until perhaps quite recently. So that's the philosopher's contribution. The scientist's contribution is perhaps best picked up by Newton. Newton's claim in the Principia to have derived his law of gravitation from the phenomena by induction without recourse to hypotheses, metaphysical or physical. Because of Newton's enormous prestige, this came to be the general accepted view of natural philosophers, that philosophy was unnecessary, redundant. Natural philosophy is about evidence and theory, and metaphysics and epistemology and all that waffle that philosophers go on about is irrelevant, and we can just ignore it. Actually, if you look at the first edition of the Principia, you find that there are 9 hypotheses, labelled as hypotheses. And what Newton seems to have done in the second and third edition was to remove do a sort of cover-up, so that some of these hypotheses became phenomena. Some of these hypotheses became rules of reasoning, and some of them just kind of mysteriously evaporated. And he then added this extra clause to say it was just, he derived his law by induction from the phenomena. And this is still today the official view of the scientific community. The now president of the Royal Society said recently, science is just the systematic acquisition of knowledge based on evidence. This is the official view. I call it standard empiricism. And it is untenable. And there's a very simple argument to show that it is. That in theoretical physics, the only kind of theory that ever gets accepted is a unified theory. A theory that says the same laws apply to all the phenomena that the theory applies to. You can't have a theory that says one set of laws over here, another set of laws over here, another set of laws over here, sort of patchwork quilt theory. You can always concoct theories like that fit the facts even better than the theories we accept. But there are endlessly many such theories that can be concocted. You can say wild things about what's going to happen tomorrow and the day after, and develop theories that predict all sorts of amazing things which are just as successful empirically up until tomorrow or the day after, perhaps, as the theories we accept. But those theories never get accepted for a moment. Consider. In my view, what this means is that the persistent acceptance of unified theories only, the great theories of physics, Newtonian theory, classical electrodynamics, quantum theory, special relativity, general relativity, the Standard Model, persistent acceptance of unified theories only, ignoring endlessly many empirically more successful disunified theories, means that there is a big assumption built into the whole enterprise. There is some kind of underlying unity in nature. And science isn't really possible without some such assumption. But this is just a massive, great assumption. We don't have a hotline to God to reassure us that we're thinking along the same lines. So it's really important that instead of pretending it isn't there, we make it explicit so that we can criticize it and try and improve it and develop it. And what I've done in both books is put forward a new conception of science which provides us with a methodology for the progressive improvement of these big metaphysical assumptions. What we need to do is to represent them in the form of a hierarchy of assumptions. And as you go up the hierarchy, the assumptions get less and less substantial, and so more likely to be true, because the less you say, the better your chances of not being false, and more nearly such that their truth is required for science to be possible at all. So at the top we have the assumption that the universe is such that we can acquire some knowledge of something locally to make life possible. Well, if that's false, we've had it whatever we assume. So we're never going to want to reject that, even though, what I'm really having to shout against these people, even though we have no reason to suppose that it's true. And then the next assumption is that the universe is such that we can put forward some conjecture about it, which will enable us to improve our methods for improving knowledge. And we should adopt that assumption, a conjecture, because if it's true, it's going to be very useful, very good, and it doesn't really do too much harm. So it's worthwhile adopting that assumption. And then we need something a bit more specific on all those lines. At my next level, we have the assumption that the universe is comprehensible in some way. There is some kind of explanation as to why everything happens the way it does. It might be that everything happens the way it does because God wills it. It might be there is some cosmic purpose, or it might be there's some underlying unified pattern of physical law. The next level is the more substantial assumption that the universe is physically comprehensible. There is indeed some kind of unified pattern of physical law governing all phenomena. And then we have something more specific, possibly string theory. And then we have our current theories, general relativity and the standard model, and then we have the phenomena, the evidence. And what this provides is a framework of relatively stable assumptions high up in the hierarchy, within which much more substantial and assumptions very likely to be false low down in the hierarchy, where we can improve and develop our assumptions, and choosing those assumptions which seem to lead to the most empirically progressive research programs. It means that we can, it provides a sort of meta-methodology for improving the methods of science. And I think this has actually gone on in science. If it hadn't, we'd still be stuck with Aristotle. It's just it hasn't been properly recognized. The theoretical physicist who I think has come closest to seeing physics in this way was Einstein. Well, it isn't just that there are metaphysical assumptions built into the aims of science. There are also values, and there are also assumptions about the social use of science in various ways. And these are also profoundly problematic. And so we need to really see science as made up of not just two domains of discussion, evidence and theory, but evidence, theory, and aims. And scientists and non-scientists seem to be, ought to be collaborating on discussion of what the aims of science should be. And we need to do this both in the interests of intellectual integrity, scientific integrity, and in order to develop a science which is intelligently and sensitively responsive to the best interests of humanity. And this book, the Green Book, ends with my argument for wisdom inquiry, the more general argument. And what I argue is also that there is actually something very important to be learned from the conception of science that I was just indicating, which I call amotive empiricism, about improving the methods of science as science proceeds. As we improve our knowledge about how to improve knowledge, something that clearly goes on at the experimental level. As we improve our knowledge, we develop our instruments, which helps us develop new knowledge, and so it's a sort of positive feedback process. But it also goes on, I'm arguing, at the theoretical level. And there's something very important to be learned from the extraordinary intellectual success of science about how we can achieve success in other areas of human life where we really do need to make progress, and where progress is much more uncertain, in particular progress towards social progress, towards a better, wiser world. And that's what the final chapter is about. This book, the black book, or the sort of purple book, is a much more modest book. It just sets out to solve 8 fundamental philosophical problems about the nature of science. The problem of undetermination of theory by evidence, the problem of what does it mean to say a theory is unified or explanatory, the problem of why we are justified in science to giving preference to unified or explanatory theories, the problem of what can it mean to say that physics makes progress if it moves from one false theory to another false theory, the problem of induction, the problem of what scientific method precisely is and how it's to be justified, and the problem of a rational method of discovery. And very modestly, it solves all these problems. And the primary problem is the problem of induction, which has been around ever since, at least since David Hume formulated it over 276 years ago, and all sorts of people have been struggling to solve it. Keynes, well, Hume, Kant, Keynes, Bertrand Russell, Popper, and it may seem a bit arrogant of me, actually, to say I've solved it, but the point is that there's nothing really very clever about it. What I've done is to show that in order to solve it, we need to adopt this view of science that I've been talking about, aim-oriented empiricism, with its levels of metaphysical assumptions. Because what this enables us to do is to have different arguments for adopting these assumptions at different levels. And insofar as people have sort of tried to solve it along these lines, for example, J.S. Mill and Bertrand Russell, they've just had metaphysics at one level. There's some sort of uniformity of nature, and it then becomes impossible. So it's not anything very technically brilliant, although there are a few little twists to it. But it is actually decisive. Finally, the problem has been cracked. So I say in all modesty. And I think that the fact that aim-oriented empiricism turns out to solve the problem and to be necessary for solving the problem is a very strong argument in support of this view. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Roger. Remember me? Physics.
Sorry?
Physics.
Yes.
Boscovich.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
I've been telling my wife about you.
Yeah.
The Boscovich man. Well, as you know, I'm a great admirer of Boscovich.
Yeah.
Of course, if you do aim-oriented empiricism, then Boscovich is a crucial figure. And in my book, chapter 5. In chapter 5, what I do is try and spell out the implications of putting aim-oriented empiricism into practice for theoretical physics.
Yeah.
And of course, Boscovich comes out as an absolute hero, because Boscovich's metaphysics is almost the only metaphysics of physics that is consistent and viable. You know, it presents us with a possible world that sort of does things like produce attractive forces, repulsive forces, cohesive forces, so you can understand how you could get solid objects, for example. And you know, all the other views, from field theory to field and particle theory, have all sorts of problems with them. Quantum theory and string theory don't really do